Thank you for logging on to today's webinar, Digging into the Biopsychosocial, Addressing the Holistic, Multifaceted Needs of Individuals in Treatment and Recovery. My name is Marla Kaufman, and I'm the Communication and Health Promotion Associate at IRETA. I'll be moderating our webinar today. I would like to go over some quick housekeeping items about how to use the WebEx technology and how to access continuing education credits. First, we would like to encourage you all to participate in today's webinar through a few ways. If you have any questions for our presenter or are experiencing any technical issues, please use either the chat function or the Q&A panel to communicate your questions. Our presenter, Dr. James Berry, will take questions at the end of the webinar. Feel free to submit your questions through the chat or Q&A box at any time. This webinar is approved for 1 PCB and/or NADAC credits, which are free. A certificate of attendance will also be available to download from your MyIRETA account. Please take note that it will take up to 48 hours for your CEUs and certificate to be available in your MyIRETA profile because we have to cross-check your attendance with WebEx following the webinar. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email. This email will include a link to an evaluation form for the webinar, as well as more information on how to access your certificate of attendance and continuing education credits. We may send you an additional email to remind you of the evaluation. I would now like to introduce today's presenter. James H. Berry, D.O., is Professor and Chair of the Department of Behavioral Medicine and Psychiatry at West Virginia University School of Medicine and Director of Addictions. He and his colleagues at WVU have developed innovative community-based treatment models in response to the addiction epidemic in Appalachia and are actively engaged in groundbreaking neuroscience research through the WVU Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute. Okay, Dr. Berry, if you are ready, I will hand things over to you.
I am ready, and thank you very much. And it is my distinct pleasure to be able to present this material to you all today. Thank you for logging in and joining us. What I hope to do over the time that we have together during this hour is to dig in, but what I'm really trying to do is give everyone a little bit more than a superficial understanding of the biopsychosocial model and the various psychologic treatments that are available to our patients and clients, as well as the important social elements of treatment and recovery and the importance of spirituality and faith communities and helping our folks get better. I recognize that this is a broad audience and many of you are working and living in various spheres within your community and various spheres of influence and professions. And so again, what I'm going to try to do is give a nice broad overview with some depth, but ultimately trying to whet your appetite to study some of these things a little bit further if you're interested in some of these modalities, but also give you a framework by which to understand the patient or client as a whole human being and what we're trying to accomplish in the treatment and recovery realm. And then if I play my cards right, we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end of this presentation. So this is a question that I get periodically from patients who come in seeking treatment from me for addiction. It's, "Doc, can I get a brain transplant?" And in some ways, this is a very legitimate question that a lot of patients have because they recognize that something inside their head and their very being propels them to engage in these crazy and destructive behaviors that they know is harmful and even bad for them and those that they love and care about, but they just can't stop using. And there's been much information that's come out over the last 10 or 15 years to really help people understand the nature of addiction as a disease or a disorder of the brain. And so there's a recognition of that. And like I said, I will have patients every now and then, mostly joking, of course, but can I just get a brain transplant and solve all my problems? But one of the most important things that I can emphasize as an addiction psychiatrist, a specialist in addiction who's been working with this problem for the last 20 plus years, is that humans are not brains on legs, is that this addiction is very complex. The brain is itself a very glorious organ. All of our experience and all of our behavior is mediated through this amazing ball of neural tissue. And much attention in the medical and scientific communities over the past 30, 40 years even has focused on the brain. And we're still scratching the surface with our understanding of the brain. There's been a lot of work and effort done to help us understand the various receptors within the neural tracts of the brain and the neurotransmitters that are firing and releasing and working on these receptors during periods of distress and during periods of intoxication and withdrawal, and are responsible for things like cravings, etc. A lot of medications have been developed over the years based on what we've learned regarding all of this information from the brain and the scientific community, medical scientific community, and advances. Much of the work that we're doing even here in the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute is worked on neuromodulation of the brain, even doing deep brain stimulation or what's called low intensity focused ultrasound that helps us harness our understanding of what we've been able to learn regarding these brain tracts to use that to our advantage in helping people who are suffering from addiction. However, all that being said, if we want to truly help people, we need to understand the whole person, and understanding the brain is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And the root word of health is whole and holistic. And so us humans, we are richly complex creatures, and we cannot be reduced to just one part of ourselves. And we are at our healthiest when we are truly and most fully integrated. And I would argue that the best treatment and the best help that we can offer those in our community who are suffering from addiction is try to incorporate all of the elements that contribute to disease and also foster health. And so you see a number of those elements in pictorial form on this slide. So individual therapy, group therapy, proper diet, possibly prescriptions, exercise, work, having meaning and purpose in your life, as well as faith communities. Those are all examples of some of the elements that are responsible for who we are and how we can flourish and thrive. And so I do write a lot of medications, for instance. I write a lot of medications as a psychiatrist, and I write a lot of medications specifically for the addictive processes. But whenever I do so, I'm always keep in mind that that is just one piece of the puzzle of treatment. And so I may be targeting the brain in some of these treatments, but I understand that I'm really trying to help the person in a holistic way with every area of their life. So this is a really good definition, I think, of addiction as defined by the American Society of Addiction Medicine, and it's the most recent definition. This definition has evolved over the last couple of decades, and this is what they released in 2019. Addiction is a treatable, and I'm really glad that they included that in this definition, because addiction is often seen by either individual people who are suffering from addiction or their family members or friends or just the culture at large as a hopeless condition, and it most certainly is not. And if it was a hopeless condition, then I certainly wouldn't be in this field, but I have the privilege and pleasure of getting to see people get better every day. And so it is a treatable condition. It's a chronic medical disease. So it's not an acute disease. It's not something like pneumonia where you can just give somebody an antibiotic and kill the bug that's affecting their lungs. You can't do that with a chronic disease. And so it's important to understand that chronic diseases really need to be approached in a multifactorial and over a long period of time, and we can't expect quick fixes. It's involving complex interactions among brain circuits, among genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. And people with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue their use despite harmful consequences. So I really appreciate this definition from ACM. And it is getting at the reality that addiction, even though it involves the brain, has much larger influences and forces at work that we can consider. And which leads me then to the biopsychosocial model of health. And this is a framework that I think is very, very helpful and positive as we all consider the nature of disease and the nature of health. And there's three main spheres to consider. And one is the biologic sphere. And this is the idea that either an organ or a system of organs has become impaired and is therefore resulting in predictable signs and symptoms of a disease. And you can use something like diabetes as an example that falls into, again, another chronic disease that falls into the framework of the biopsychosocial model of health and disease. And so in diabetes, the biology that's impacted, the organ that's impacted is the pancreas. And it's set up that way depending on what type of biology you may have, the type of genetics that you have, that the pancreas is impaired and it's not regulating and sending out the glucose necessary, the sugar, the blood sugar that's going to the rest of the organs appropriately. And it could be, there is a large genetic component to that. So people didn't ask to necessarily be born, of course, with diabetes, but because of their genetic load and the parents they were born to, they could be at high risk where others may not. And so there's the biology that's impacted, but then also psychology is really important in chronic disease. And the way we think about things affects how we behave and also how we feel. And actually during periods of intense stress, for instance, even in diabetes, it creates a system and a pathway of hormones that create and wreak havoc on the body and the various organs just by being severely depressed or severely anxious. And those are important. But also the way we think about health and the decisions we make can also impact the development of diabetes. So if you don't believe that diet or exercise is that important, then you are going to be more at risk to make decisions that could lead you to having and developing diabetic disease. And then the social sphere is also very impactful. And so if you grow up in a family or around a peer group that doesn't put much emphasis on exercise, for instance, and it's much more of a sedentary lifestyle, and you learn patterns of eating and patterns of exercise or behavior from your parents and from your peers, that can set you up to have diabetes if those are unhealthy. And so you can also, of course, as many of you are probably thinking, translate much of what was said in diabetes, at least the framework, to also substance use disorders or addiction. When we do think about the brain, and we do have to consider the brain, like I mentioned earlier, all of our feelings, all of our processes, and all of our behaviors are mediated through this brain, through this organ. And so it's incredibly important. And when it comes to addiction, there's three main areas of focus. One area, what's called the basal ganglia, and this is the pleasure center of our brain. And whenever we're engaged in activities that are pleasurable, that's by design so that we can continue those activities. And the idea would be that those would be activities that are healthy for us. So when we're hungry, we eat, and therefore we find pleasure in that. Dopamine is released, and it's rewarding. It lets us know, hey, let's keep doing this. Or let's say we're outside on a cold winter day, and we get the opportunity to go into a warm building and a warm, cozy room with a nice big roaring fire. And once we do that, there's dopamine released in this basal ganglia area that's rewarding, and that feels good. It says, hey, this is good for us. Let's keep doing it. The problem is when we start engaging in drugs of addiction or other behaviors of addiction, that those patterns and that dopamine is released in ways that are so much greater than those natural rewards that they start taking over, and they start rewiring the brain such that we want to do those things that become unhealthy for us because of the strong drives to do so after doing that for long enough over a period of time. So that's one area is the basal ganglia. Another area is the extended amygdala. And this is the area of the brain that's most responsible for making us feel stressed out, cranky, irritable. And when we use drugs, this is the part of the brain that gets very sensitive over time. Some people are born with this sensitivity and some develop it over time because of the behaviors in their use. And when you stop using, then this amygdala starts firing even a greater amount of time, and it makes us feel even more miserable. And then the other important part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex, that gold area of the brain, or that's colored gold in this picture. And this is the part of the brain that's sort of our board of directors. This is the executive function. This is the part that really separates us from other animals in the animal kingdom. This helps us look into the future and say, hey, this pathway is, if we make this decision, this is going to cause us a lot of problems. If we make this decision, it's going to cause us to have much greater rewards in our life. And so we can make good decisions if our prefrontal cortex is intact. But for somebody who's in the throes of addiction, much of that has been cut off and impaired. And part of our job when we're looking at trying to help people is to help strengthen that prefrontal cortex to help them make better decisions. And we can do that in concert with trying to tamp down that amygdala, that area of the brain that's responsible for irritability, for depression, and that crankiness, and then also try to curb that basal ganglia craving. So those are the three main areas that medications and even therapy can work on to help strengthen and improve. And then there's always the question of nature versus nurture. And the best way to think about it is actually it's not an either or, but a both and. And who we are is really settled by both nature and nurture. So when it comes to addiction, especially something like alcohol use disorder or opioid use disorder, it's been well demonstrated that those people who carry a genetic risk, a genetic load, have a much greater likelihood of falling in to the traps of addiction if their parents, for instance, have also addiction. And there were some sophisticated studies done several decades ago in Sweden where the large registry of patients, and that those kids who were born to parents who had alcohol use disorder, even if the twins were adopted, one twin went to a family that didn't drink and one twin went to a family that did drink, both have elevated likelihood of developing alcohol use disorder. And you see this in other addictions as well. And then, of course, environment plays a significant impact, not only on the risk of developing these disorders, but what we know now with this construct called epigenetics, even the environment can affect our genes. And so even decisions that men or women make regarding the exposure that they have to various substances before a child is actually born can affect the genetics that that child is born with. So that's an area of study. Epigenetics has become really, really fascinating in helping us understand various risks associated with a number of diseases. This is a dynamite quote by Stephen King, who himself is in recovery from alcohol use disorder. And in one of his novels, he has a character that states, beating heroin is child's play compared to beating your childhood. And this just is a very succinct recognition of the importance of our childhood development in the likelihood of us developing diseases and patterns of behavior and processes that can be harmful to us, not only in childhood, but then that we carry with us through the rest of our lives. I suspect that most of you have heard of adverse childhood experiences. If you have not heard of this term before, it's a very important area of research to look into. And for those of you who have heard it, just a reminder, so this is a term that originated in around 1995 from a study conducted by the CDC, the Centers for Control and Prevention, that worked with Kaiser Permanente in California, a large insurance group that studied over 17,000 members, 17,000 patients, and then followed them and looked at what types of features did they have in common that presented various chronic disease problems. And they identified there were a number, and these are elucidated right here. And so if somebody has physical abuse growing up, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, if they've experienced physical or emotional neglect during childhood, if they were raised in a household that had significant dysfunction. So if there were parents, one or more parents in the household who had severe untreated mental illness or who were incarcerated, if there was a lot of substance use and misuse occurring in the home, if the mother of the home was treated violently, then that was another independent risk factor. And then also homes that were experiencing a divorce. All of these were independent risk factors for developing problems. And what they determined is you can get a score. So for each one of these items, it basically is 1 point on the score of risk. And it's been determined that 4 or more of these adverse childhood experiences really shifts one from not having much risk of these sort of illnesses into having these sort of dysfunctions and illnesses. So having 4 or more, you have 3 times the risk of lung disease and smoking as an adult. 14 times the risk of the number of suicide attempts, 11 times the risk of the level of actually using intravenous drugs. People with 6 or more ACE scores can die 20 years earlier than those who have none. And this pyramid here, I think this is a nice graphic because it shows at baseline, these adverse childhood experiences can then lead to disrupted neurodevelopment, lead to social, emotional, cognitive impairment, adoption of risky behaviors when it comes to health, and then the development of disease, and then sadly, early death. And so those of us in the treatment and prevention community really want to take these adverse childhood experiences seriously and try to do what we can from a public health standpoint to minimize adverse childhood experiences, but then also to recognize and screen those of our community members who have endured adverse childhood experiences, and try to intervene appropriately so we can stop this cycle. So when you think about biologic treatment and the biopsychosocial, things that come to mind, for me anyway, are medications, okay? So medications work on the brain when it comes to addiction, and they can work in other areas to help symptoms that people may be experiencing when they're in withdrawal, or to prevent some complicated withdrawals. Diet can be a very important element by which we are trying to affect the biology. Exercise as well. Sleep is incredibly important for our biologic functioning, which affects so much of our emotions, our ability to think clearly, and just our ability to flourish. And so sleep is something that we should all take very seriously when it comes to helping our folks get better. Neuromodulation are a set of new techniques that I mentioned earlier regarding actually modulating the biology, the neurology that's within the brain to our advantage. When you think about psychologic treatments, there's a number of contexts by which you could deliver psychologic treatment. One is individual therapy, and this is where you have somebody, a skilled therapist, a trained therapist who's meeting with a client or a patient one-on-one. You can also do this in a group therapy session where you have a number of people who are experiencing the same disorder or disease, and try to use the power of the group. Much of addiction care, much of substance use disorder treatment historically has taken place and continues to take place in group therapy. Family therapy also recognizes that the patient or the client doesn't exist in isolation, hopefully, and they are not an island unto themselves, but they exist within a unit, and typically it's a family unit, and so you try to use that family unit and those dynamics and those connections to try to heal and keep someone healthy. Couples therapy, same idea. And then there's also using mini families to get together in a group therapy context to try to help patients and clients. So what are some of the benefits of group therapy? Well, one is that you really help reduce isolation that people experience. Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General, has written much on the what he calls the epidemic of loneliness that Americans are suffering right now. And those of us who've been in the addiction treatment space a long enough time also recognize how isolating addiction particularly is. So whatever we can do to reduce that isolation can be very helpful. And having group therapy is a way to do that. Also, one of the benefits of group therapy that I've always appreciated as a clinician is many people are experiencing much of the same problems, and also they can learn many of the same solutions. And so it allows me as the physician to be able to multiply what it is that I'm doing and knowing within a particular context to the benefit of many more people than if I was just doing individual treatment. And there's a shared learning experience that goes on where a synergy takes place where the force of several people is more than just the individual parts combined, but something more is happening. Individual therapy is also and should be offered as much as possible to help someone. And some of the advantages of individual therapy, of course, is you're able, as the clinician, to spend more time on a particular patient and what their particular needs are, especially if you think about somebody who has a significant trauma history in their life where it's difficult for them to be around other people, especially first starting out and first engaging in treatment. Individual therapy is typically the way to do that. And so that can be very helpful. So what are some particular therapies that are evidence-based that exist and that we can make use of? There are several evidence-based treatment strategies that exist for substance use disorders, otherwise known as addictions. One of the most heavily studied is cognitive behavioral therapy. This probably has the greatest evidence behind it in the treatment of substance use disorders because it's been around for a long time. It was developed in the 1960s. It's also can be very structured and manual based, so it lends itself to be able to study it really, really well compared to maybe some of the other therapies. It's problem focused and action oriented, meaning that you are really trying to address very specific problems that the person is experiencing and helping them solve those problems, as opposed to what you might think of as a Sigmund Freud type therapy, like psychoanalysis, where you're really trying to go back in time and try to think through and address issues that have occurred in your past that may be bubbling up and affecting your behavior today. That's not what this is. This is, again, this is present focused and problem focused. But the idea is that thoughts, behaviors, and emotions are all interconnected. And so what we think about something is going to affect both how we feel and how we act or how we behave or what we do. You can think about this ABC model when you consider cognitive behavioral therapy as an idea. So there's an activating event. That event occurs and that elicits various beliefs, thoughts, attitudes. And then there are consequences and feelings that result because of those beliefs, thoughts, and attitudes. So for instance, it's a rainy day here where I am in my office, and I could have woken up this morning and thinking, wow, it's just going to be a gray, horrible day today. And that is going to affect, because of that raining event, or is the activating event, the rainy, gray day, is I could think this is going to be a horrible day, and then I'm going to feel horrible about that. But what I can do, if I'm thoughtful or have worked with a therapist to help me think through this, is I could recognize what that automatic thought is, because it's a rainy day, doesn't mean I have to assume it's going to be a horrible day. I could come to appreciate the rain and see the rain as a necessary element for the drought we've had and how beautiful the rain is and the puddles and these sort of things, and can come to appreciate that. And then I'm going to have a much better day, and I'll be able to feel better and think through it. So that's just kind of a very simple example of what we're talking about when we mean the ABCs. And also, something called classical conditioning is worth recognizing. So here we have Ivan Pavlov, who was a psychologist researcher back in the late 1800s. And I'm sure everyone's heard of Pavlov and his dogs before, but what he did was he studied dogs, and he recognized, like everyone did, that if you were to present a plate of food to a dog, they start salivating because they're eager to eat, and that's a natural response. But what he did, which was so unique and clever, was he started ringing a bell every time he presented a dog in his studies with this bowl of food. And then over time, all he had to do was ring a bell, and the dog would salivate even without the food around. Okay. And this was called a stimulus and a response, an unconditioned stimulus and an unconditioned response. This is really important concept because we humans also experience the same thing, and especially important when it comes to addiction. And this is where people get these cues, specifically people, places, and things that they associate with their drug use, that when they see again or are among, then that's going to lead to these automatic behavioral or bodily experiences that can automatically lead to them using a substance. And so one of the jobs of a good and skilled clinician is help them understand those cues that are specific to that person. So it's not unusual, for instance, that I will have a patient who even seeing a picture of a needle will start experiencing the sweats, start experiencing cravings and some irritability as because they used to use a needle to inject their heroin. And so now, even without the heroin, if they just even see a picture, let alone if they had a needle in their hand, then it's going to cause a lot of physical and biological distress that puts them at risk for using. And so there are people, of course, that you could think of who they used to use with in certain places that you then help them learn to try to manage and avoid so that they don't put themselves in that kind of pathway. So another formal therapy is called relapse prevention, and it incorporates a number of the CBT strategies. It emphasizes having an awareness of what those warning signs are and the changes of behavior, attitudes, and emotions that could be leading to a return to use. Identify those triggers, like I mentioned, people, places, and things. They talk about that in the 12-step programs a lot, is people, places, and things. The other thing that is so helpful about relapse prevention is the strategy is to try to develop prevention plans. So while you are in a good state of mind and you're not experiencing all that distress, when you're facing those cues, is to work with someone who's skilled to help you come up with a prevention, an escape plan, if you will. Things that you can do to either avoid those people, places, and things, but also if you find yourself unawares and within those people, places, and things that are causing those kind of problems, what can you do to get out of that? Community reinforcement approach is a type of multi-factorial or has many components, specifically helpful for the adolescent community. Makes use of behavioral skills training, developing these skills to have healthy lifestyles. How do you deal with somebody, for instance, who's offering you a drug or alcohol? It helps you replace a lot of unhealthy behaviors with new recreational counseling and social skills. If you're married, helping you with your couples therapy, job counseling, and relapse prevention. So several elements in the community reinforcement approach. And then also, this is something called CRAFT, community reinforcement and family training, which takes it into a little bit of a different level than just the community reinforcement, where the focus is actually helping the family members do what they can and develop skills to help that identified client or patient stay away from substances and really develop a lifestyle of recovery. So the focus is really on helping the family members do what they can to support their friend or loved one who is suffering. Contingency management. So this is a type of therapy that is also manualized and rigorous and has been studied a lot over the last several decades. Particular efficacy when it comes to stimulants like cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine. And this is really involves carrots and sticks, punishment and reward, and how our behavior can be shaped by these rewards or punishments. So we know this if we've been in any of the treatment community settings for any length of time, right? So a lot of people enter treatment after they've been given an ultimatum by a spouse, by a parent or an employer, or even the judicial system and the legal system. And so those are some of the sticks that have been used. But contingency management specifically is trying to use rewards. And unlike the classical conditioning with Pavlov, it's making use of a different type of learning, which is called operant conditioning. And here you see a picture of myself and my dog Chester, an Airedale Terrier. And my son taught Chester to stick him up, put up his hands with a treat. And we were able to, through my son's training of Chester, that I could tell him stick him up and he will lift his paws up high into the air and not even have a treat available. And so he learned that over time. And the idea is that we can learn to change behaviors over time with practice, and you use rewards to do so. So early on, we had to use the reward of the treat to get him to do that, but he can do that now without a treat anywhere around. And so contingency management can be used and harnessed to reinforce these desired behaviors through these rewards. And so the idea is that you're using a voucher or some sort of prize if a patient, for example, comes in and is able to give you a urine test that is free of methamphetamine, then they get a little reward for that. And one of the ways that can be very effective then over time is that starts building. So you get one negative test, you get, let's say, $1 of a reward, and you get 2 negative tests, within a week, and you get $5. And if you get 3 negative tests within 2 weeks, you get $10. And it kind of increases over time. And that makes use of, again, what's going on inside the brain and to try to develop an anticipation of that reward. And it's been really, really effective. It's pretty remarkable how something like this has been demonstrated to really reduce somebody's use of methamphetamine and be able to stay substance free. The problem with it is that is simple in theory, but it takes a lot of heavy lifting to get it and build it into practice and to be able to do it well and to be able to do it over long term. And it does require, of course, resources to be able to do that. But that's something that you should all be aware of, and it's being highly researched now and been demonstrated to help a lot with methamphetamine, cocaine, amphetamine disorders. So one of my favorite skills that I've learned early on and was exposed to, and many of us in the addiction treatment setting have been exposed to this, is something called motivational interviewing. And this is something that can be used in conjunction with other therapies, but it's really more of a skill set and an art of being with someone else that can help them develop change and go in the direction of change. And it's actually, this is what they state in their book. Motivational interviewing is about arranging conversations so that people talk themselves into change. It's based on their own values and interests. Attitudes are not only reflected in, but are actively shaped by speech. And so what motivational interviewing attempts to do is to help the clinician, like myself, recognize what the patient is saying and pick up on those words in that speech that suggest what their own internal motivation is for change, and try to enhance that as much as possible, and bring that out into the open. It's a collaborative conversation style for, again, helping discern what their own motivation and commitment to change is, and making use of that. Here's a picture of goats in a tree. And if we thought about our clients or patients who found themselves stuck in a tree, and how do we help them get down and stay down? Okay. So one approach is to say, you know what, they created their own problem. They got up in the tree, and they're just going to figure it out. Okay, you can do that, but then you're going to have a lot of trees filled with broken and distressed and unhealthy people that are creating problems for themselves and creating problems for others. You could take a ladder, and you can try to then go up and pick them up and bring them back down. You can threaten to get them down, and coax or cajole them with either rewards or punishments, like contingency management. However, often if that's the case, then they'll likely go up if you're not around anymore, or if you haven't done the treatment like contingency management long enough. But what if you were actually able to help that goat discover and think through their own motivation, their own desires for wanting to stay out of that tree, and developing some healthy alternatives to going up in that tree? Then if you're successful with doing that, then you could keep that goat down and out of that tree for a long period of time, if not their whole lives. It also, motivational interviewing works well with this stages of change model. And I would say actually not only motivational interviewing, but also any of the therapies that we're considering, or any of the treatments. It's really good to recognize that behavioral change and motivation to change occurs on a spectrum, as opposed to thinking about change as either they're motivated or not motivated, or either they're just ready or not ready for change. But to really classify where this person is on a stage of change. So beginning with pre-contemplation, meaning they're coming to you and they have no interest of changing their behavior at all. And they can work through thinking about it, to actually preparing to change, to having the action where they're actually engaged in trying to make a change. And what you want to do is tailor your treatment and your approach to whatever particular stage of change they are at. So it can be, somewhat counterproductive and even disastrous if you're approaching a person who is in a pre-contemplative stage of change as if they were in the action stage, and you're going to be pushing and pushing and pushing, and it's just going to create much more tension for that person, as opposed if you try a set of techniques when they were in pre-contemplation. In contemplation. And I would say it's the pre-contemplation, the contemplation stages where motivational interviewing is of the most value, because it recognizes this concept of ambivalence, meaning that there are reasons why we want to continue to use the substances, and there are reasons why we don't. And because we've got stuck in that track of addiction, that we continue to be engaged in the addictive behaviors. But if a skilled clinician can help you actually take a look at that ambivalence and help evoke and foster those reasons why you would want to make a change, and those reasons why you would want to stop using the substance over time, you can help them move along that stage. And that's where motivational interviewing comes in. There's also been a lot of research, especially over the last 10 years, on mindfulness, being able to recognize the present moment, and appreciating our body and the mind-body interaction. And there's a number of emerging research and treatment that make use of mindfulness-based interventions. The matrix model is another multi-component many components to this model that I think can be very effective. This is another model that's been useful for specifically for stimulant use disorders. Dialectical behavioral therapy in addiction. So DBT is a type of therapy that was developed specifically for borderline personality disorder. It's got four main components. One is mindfulness, one is recognizing our tolerance for distress and being able to regulate our emotions, and then help us also interact with other people in ways that can be productive and healthy. And this has been also translated beyond borderline personality disorders for elements that could be helpful for people who are suffering from addiction. 12-step facilitation is another evidence-based treatment that has a lot of research behind it for the last 40 years. It's manualized that helps a clinician help a patient or client get involved and make use of 12-step meetings and focusing on concepts of acceptance, surrender, and getting active in service in the meetings. So where actually do most of the people who suffer from substance use disorders or addiction, where do they actually seek help? Vast majority of them historically and continue to this day get help at mutual support groups like 12-step programs. Alcoholics Anonymous is the first one, and AA was developed by two guys back in the 30s who suffered from alcohol use disorder, Bill W. and Dr. Bob, who realized that as much as they tried and failed to stay sober long-term on their own, they couldn't do it. But once they started helping one another and helping others do just that, they were able to discover and learn common principles to help those in their community who were suffering from alcohol problems. And it grew into the 12-step program, Alcoholics Anonymous. It's got 25 years or more of NIH-facilitated research. A lot of the research that comes out demonstrates as good or better results than some of the modern interventions. The thing about AA and other 12-step programs and mutual support groups is they're so cost effective, and they exist in almost every community around the world now, and even you can do it virtually as well. And you can certainly get the bang out of your buck. Why does it work? How does it help? Well, a number of factors have been demonstrated that really come into play. One is you're able to change your social networks that actually support abstinence and recovery as opposed to using social network. You're able to see yourself improve as well as other people in the group improve as well, which can give you hope and really practice your coping skills. It helps you maintain recovery motivation over time. When you're in a group, you're caught along with that current of the group towards a goal that's actually going to be good for you, and that can be very helpful. It also increases spirituality. I'll talk about that in a minute. Decreases depressive symptoms, decreases cravings, and decreases impulsivity. I love this quote too by Carl Jung, who is a psychiatrist who was in correspondence with Bill W. from AA, who actually tried helping a lot of people who had alcohol problems in his day and didn't have much success, but he was able to come to appreciate the fantastic success of AA. And he says this, is that research suggests that AA's effects are most likely to do what he called the protective wall of human community. And I think that's just such a beautiful quote that encapsulates much of what's happening in the 12-step community is the protective wall of human community. So not only is there AA, but there's Narcotics Anonymous, there's Smart Recovery, Rational Recovery that are more based on really CBT type principles, less focus on spirituality. Celebrate Recovery is a group that's a 12-step, or not 12-step, but a mutual support group that uses some of the 12-step principles. That's more of a Christian-based program. There's Recovery Dharma, which is more of a Buddhist-based principle program, but there's many, many others. And I try to encourage all of my patients as a doctor to get involved, to find which ones really work for them and that they can find some benefit from. Here's a great picture that's in Alcoholics Anonymous lore, and two guys, this is actually supposed to reflect Bill W. and Dr. Bob meeting with a with another guy called Bill Dotson, who was the third person to join their group. But it really shows where they meet this person where they are in the middle of their suffering. And that's what's good about these 12-step programs, because unlike me as a paid clinician, I could really have limited time and impact on a patient during the week. However, with these 12-step communities and mutual support groups, they can be available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in the day and age now, post-COVID, of course, we've got so many opportunities to have virtual access. So there, you can go on the internet and you can find hundreds of groups available anytime, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, anywhere around the world. So I have patients actually currently who attend meetings in New Zealand, for instance, in England and Germany, from the comfort of their own home. And so that's a lot of fun. Just really briefly, spirituality is also so important and a much neglected component of who we are and what can lead to good health outcomes. Much research has demonstrated the importance of one's spirituality and faith in improving outcomes, yet it's really an underdeveloped area that many health systems have shied away from in more of the modern age. I put this book on here, Hostility to Hospitality. And this is a book by a married couple of clinicians at Harvard. One is actually a family medicine clinician, and the other is a cleric there at Harvard hospitals, that was some of the Harvard hospitals. And it's a really, really good book that outlines a lot of the research behind health outcomes and the importance of trying to address this. Most people actually who go in to try to receive healthcare would report that their spiritual lives are important areas that should be considered. And so we can do what we can to try to incorporate elements and help encourage those things that will help them to be healthy. So one of the other areas that I try to get all the patients that I run into and have contact with and trying to come up with treatment plans is finding out if they've been part of it, if either they are part of a faith community now or they've been part of the faith community in the past. And would they be interested in trying to reevaluate and reintroduce that element into their lives? And again, much research has demonstrated those people who are part of regular faith communities have better healthcare outcomes than those who aren't. And then, of course, we've got a number of social factors that can influence our various disease states and help lead to either greater health or poorer health. So work, transportation problems, dentistry. One of the programs that we in our facility set up, our residential treatment facility for addiction, actually we have a dental van that comes once or twice a week to see our clients who are there in the residential setting to try to help them with their dental care. And that's been so well received. And there's also a lot of evidence that if you help somebody with their dental care, that the rest of their body is going to heal and be much better functioning. Then, of course, childcare, housing, food security, all of these elements are important in who we are as human beings. And whatever we can do to shore up these various factors, that it's going to be we're going to have a much greater impact on our patients. The Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration and the federal government has identified 4 major dimensions of recovery. One is health, which we've already talked about. One is community, which we have already also talked about, the importance of community and really trying to battle that epidemic of loneliness and getting people in the right types of community that's going to foster well-being. Creating a home environment so that they have shelter and they have a place to stay out of the elements. That's a home base for them that they can then go out and try to thrive. And then I think it's so important, and I'm so glad that they included purpose. And if you have a reason to get up in the morning and continue your life in the day, it's going to be much better for you to strive for health. So in summary, health, holistic, we talked about all of these elements. And at this point, I am willing to entertain questions that you may have. Of course, I went all the way up to the hour, but I could still stick around and answer some questions for some time.
Thanks so much, Dr. Barry. We did have one question that came in during the presentation. Charles asked, do you think that ibogaine, I don't know if I'm saying that right, will be
Ibogaine?
yeah, ibogaine will be a useful treatment?
Yeah, so it's hard to tell. So there's a number of substances and drugs out there right now, many of which are in the plant world that show some potential for some therapeutic processes, but unfortunately, they just have not been held to the same sort of rigorous standards that we have for medications that have gone through the FDA process. So unfortunately, there are a lot of things out there that people just start using because of antidotes and other reasons, but it's actually can cause a lot of harm for people because there isn't a great understanding regarding the risks that are associated with some of these substances. And it's tempting to think just because it's natural that it could be good for you, and it very well may be, but then also a failure to really appreciate what are those risks associated with it. So to be determined, but I think what we all want to do is study anything that can help people over time, but it's got to go through the rigorous study and research process to demonstrate safety and efficacy. In the meantime, there are medications that have gone through that process, and we need to give people access to those medicines that have demonstrated that.
All right, thanks for that answer. No other questions came in during the presentation. Um, One just came in. Is there more training regarding addiction? My husband's doctor told him, well, can't you just go away for a weekend and drink? I'm not
Okay.
really sure
So
what that's in reference to.
yeah, and so I think again that's sort of a misconception that a lot of people have is again you treat addiction like you treat pneumonia, where if you get pneumonia, you have a bug that has infected your lungs. And so it's gotten severe enough where you really cannot breathe or having difficulty breathing. You need to go to the hospital. You get admitted to the hospital. You're given antibiotics to treat that bug, to kill that bug off. You might be given fluids and some other medicines to make you comfortable. And then over several days, you're cured of that bug, and doctor can pat you on the head and say, go home. However, a lot of people think you can do that with addiction, and you can't. So if some people think you could just go into my inpatient hospital, for instance, and have a 7-day stay to detox you from alcohol, and that we could, once we get you through the detox stage of severe withdrawal, we could pat you on the head and send you home and say you're cured from your addiction. It just doesn't work, unfortunately. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And so that's why it's so important to recognize it more in the chronic disease category, where we try to follow people all over time and try to connect them with many of these other elements of treatment that are going to help them outside the hospital.
Right. I will say too, at IRETA we do a medical student fellowship every summer to kind of help with these misconceptions for current medical students, and I've been a part of it for the past 6 years now, and I'll say just in the past 6 years it seems like the kids that come, they seem to come to us with a lot more awareness of what addiction actually
Yeah,
is.
I love to hear that. And that's been my experience too. I think that we've done a good job. I mean, again, I started doing this work 20 years ago, and there was horrible stigma then, and there was a ton of misunderstanding. But I would also say over the last, it seems like, 5 to 6, 7 years, we've done a good job of trying to educate, especially the healthcare community, and really focus on our trainees, like our medical students and nursing students. And so I've also seen an improvement in their understanding.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great thing for the future, hopefully.
Absolutely.
All right, well, we are at the hour, so I will wrap up here with a few last housekeeping items for folks looking for CEUs. I just want to say thanks so much to Dr. Barry again for this great presentation. We really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. And then also, I can't remember if I mentioned it early on, but I do have the slides available for anybody who needs them, and you can contact Irina.
Yes, we will, we'll be posting those on our website along with the recording of this webinar in within a week of the conclusion of this. We would also like to remind you all of our evaluation and CEU process. You will receive several follow-up emails from us. Well, you'll receive one follow-up email from us. It will include a link to the evaluation and step-by-step instructions on how to obtain CEUs. Please note that it will take up to 48 hours for your CEUs to become available. We would like to request that you fill out our evaluation. It should take no longer than 2 minutes of your time. Again, we want to thank everyone for taking time out of your day to participate. If you have any questions at all, please email us. The email address is info@ireta.org. And with that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone.